Tonight's video is sponsored by the White Vault podcast and YouTube channel. If you enjoy my channel, Entropic Society, odds are that you enjoy stories of humanity surviving, or sometimes not, in some of the most difficult conditions on Earth. Today I'd like to recommend one such story, a horror fiction podcast and YouTube channel, set within the chilling polar night of Svalbard, the White Vault. It's an audio story similar to Entropic Society, but with a full voice cast where an international rescue and repair team is sent to discover the source of a mysterious signal at a remote Arctic research station. They become trapped when the weather takes a turn for the worst, but they also make a number of shocking discoveries, lurking just beneath the ice. The White Vault has won countless awards, over 30 Audioverse awards, in addition to a Webby Award, and 3 Webby honorees for Best Music and Sound Design. Find the White Vault however you listen to podcasts, and especially on YouTube. Subscribe now, and delve into the waiting horrors. Story 1. The Closet. My wife and I were recent college graduates during the pandemic. My job I had been interning at for the last 3 months just informed me that they had a hiring freeze, and I would have to wait before I could start my job. My wife, however, was much luckier than I was, and was able to land a job over in Jerome, Idaho, a small quiet town just off the main highway. Lucky for us, my wife's distant uncle lived in the town just over, in Twin Falls, who she had recently reached out for on advice on where to find an apartment. Evidently her Uncle Charles happened to have an opening at his house, since his basement was sectioned off as a separate living space and that his kids had moved out. The only downside was that she didn't know her uncle very well. He was one of those that hardly came to any family functions or kept up with any of the family members due to past trauma. I guess there were some unresolved issues between the aunts and uncles. Thankfully, this resentment didn't overflow into the nieces and nephews. We offered him some money to allow us to stay there, but he refused. He said he'd let us stay there for free just because he wanted the company. She went over the details with him and he gave us their address. Despite the world seemingly falling apart, this was working out for us quite well. We drove the long hours in a U-Haul from Arizona up to Idaho, towing the one car that we shared between us. Jocelyn, my wife, showed me some pictures of the basement where we would be staying. The pictures were less than ideal, but on the same note, the place didn't seem too terrible regardless. We took turns driving when we finally crossed the bridge over into Twin Falls. The canyon we drove over was beautiful and was a stark contrast between the bland landscape that surrounded the rest of the town. Her uncle's house was clear on the other side of town, which gave us an opportunity to drive through the quaint town to see what it was like. The town itself didn't have too much to give, but it had everything that we would need. In fact, this would be a nice change of pace from all the hustle and bustle that we're used to in the busy city. We slowly crept through the town in our huge truck and continued past to the other side of the outskirts. We finally arrived to her uncle's house, which had several cars parked out front. The home was less than ideal, but her uncle was letting us stay here for free. We knocked on the front door to announce our arrival, but no one answered. Jocelyn sent a message to her uncle on Facebook letting him know that we just arrived. We then walked around back to the basement entrance. Thankfully, the back door was unlocked. Inside was a typical looking basement with old furniture and wallpaper. We did a quick tour of the basement and noticed that the door that led to the upstairs was locked. The basement was clearly old, but thankfully looked to have been cleaned a while ago. We moved our stuff from the trucks to inside, which took us around 2 hours, and situated most of our things with the old furniture that was left behind. The home didn't have Wi-Fi, so we relied on our phone data to keep us connected to the internet. The home itself was decent, but was clearly old. The walls and ceiling would pop and crack occasionally, despite there not being someone upstairs. The basement had everything we needed, thus making us not need to go upstairs for anything. Jocelyn tried messaging her uncle again, saying that we just moved in and how grateful we were, but for whatever reason, he'd stopped messaging us. A few days ended up passing, and we did not see nor talk to him at all. It was kind of bizarre. living in someone's house that you haven't met, let alone talked to. I, for one, had no contact with him at all. Eventually, my wife started her job, and I would be home alone, either working part-time online on my phone or applying for jobs in town. Being alone doesn't really bother me, but something about that house really gave me the creeps. There was still no sign that anyone else lived in that house, let alone her uncle. That is until one day, I went out to go check the mail and noticed that the front door to the upper part of the house was open. I was hoping that this would be my opportunity to finally meet Uncle Charles. I peeked my head inside and saw that the upper part of the house was much different than that of the basement section, where we were living. The main part of the house was much darker, with newspapers covering the insides of the windows. The main section didn't seem to have any furniture, at least that I could see. But aside from all of that, that's not what concerned me. I listened silently as I could hear crying coming from the bedroom area of the house. The crying was muffled, but it seemed to be feminine in nature. I was concerned, but I also wanted to respect the owner's privacy and went around back down to the basement. After that brief encounter, things began to get weird. There would be times throughout the day that I'd hear obvious movement upstairs, like something falling or something being dragged. So I'd go outside and walk around to the front door to introduce myself as the person living in his basement, but no one ever answered the door. I mentioned how this was weird and almost made me uncomfortable, how I hadn't met this uncle, but Jocelyn assured me that this was normal for him, and to not to ruin a good thing that we had going. I pushed my concerns to the back of my mind, as my wife was right. I tried looking in town for alternatives to our housing situation, but everything was either out of our price range or not available due to COVID. After about a week of living there, I began to see strange things at night, mainly in the closet of our room. I would be laying in bed and subtle movements would catch my eye. It looked as if a dark figure would peek its head out, ever so briefly, and watch me as I laid in bed. Our bed was situated in a way that only I could see into this closet, and not Jocelyn. This terrified me to the point that I couldn't move. Surely this had to be some figment of my imagination, the conjuring of images due to stress in my mind. This wouldn't be the first time that my mind made me worry about something that wasn't really there. I didn't want to say anything to Jocelyn since I knew that this would scare her. Working was stressing her out and I didn't want to add more of it because I thought I was seeing things. My solution to this obvious problem was, before I went to bed, I'd close the closet door. However, it wasn't until the week Jocelyn was out of town that I began to realize that something was wrong. Usually Jocelyn would wake up before me and get ready for the day. This would include opening the closet door and getting dressed. The week she was gone, however, I felt like things began to escalate. There were a few times where I'd take a break from whatever I was doing, and I noticed that the door handle that led to the upstairs would sometimes jiggle, as if someone on the other side was trying to get in. What was worse was, at night I would close the closet door and wake up the next day to find it slightly opened. That day, I went to the hardware store and bought a padlock to put on the closet door. Perhaps I was being too paranoid or just a big fraidy cat, but this was able to give me peace of mind that I needed in order to still stay in that room. Once I got home, the first thing I did was install that padlock, and I went about my day. I had a couple of job interviews in town, so my day was quite busy. Unfortunately, none of the positions I applied for were a good fit for what I was looking for in terms of work. To be fair, the town didn't have much to offer, aside from trucking or farming. I came back to what I thought was an empty house, since Jocelyn was still away and I had still yet to meet Charlie. I went about my nightly routine and made myself some dinner before watching a movie on my phone and got ready for bed. I had another interview the next day, so I made sure to get to bed early so I was prepared. My night routine was simple: FaceTime Jocelyn, brush my teeth, make sure my clothes were ready for the next day, but also make sure that the closet door was locked. It wasn't terribly hard to do, and I made sure not to make any mention of how weird I felt in the house, especially the closet, to Jocelyn when I called her. We hung up and I eventually went to bed. My dream that night was weird. It was one of those that felt real. I had dreamt that I was back in town, and a man with some type of burlap sack on his head stood in the middle of the road. No one else was around. The brown sack on his head had 2 large holes where I could see his eyes. His eyes were dark, and I could tell that this person had a negative aura about him. He told me that I needed to wake up because something terrible was coming to get me. I could feel an evil grip around me, and I couldn't breathe. I finally woke up and sat up, trying to catch my breath. I was sweating, and the dark aura I felt in my dream had overflowed into my real life. I was still afraid. I reached over to Jocelyn for comfort, but was soon reminded that I was alone for the week, or so I thought. I laid back down in bed when I heard a noise that instantly scared me. The closet door began to softly rattle. At first, I could hear the handle slowly move, as it would always make a squeak if you turned it more than halfway. Next, I could hear the door open slightly, before getting caught on the recently installed padlock I had just put on that door. The combination of fear from my dream and the current circumstances made my body freeze with absolute terror. Whatever was on the other side of that door tried its best to be as quiet as possible. It was clear that who or whatever it was trying its best to be quiet so that I wouldn't wake up. Seeing that the door wouldn't open all the way, whoever it was began to get frustrated. They then tried to open the door slightly more aggressively. I did the only thing my body would allow me, which was to reach down next to my bed and grab a flashlight that I kept next to it and turned it on, hoping that the light being shined on the door was enough of a deterrent to stop whoever was trying to come in. But to my dismay, this had an opposite effect. The door began to shake violently, and I could see the door open only a few inches and someone reaching their fingers through. From my perspective, the fingers were incredibly long and gnarled at each joint, making the hand seem like its owner was some twisted creature that should not share our realm of existence. The tips of the fingers were blackened, as if they were necrotic or frostbitten, but the parts of the hand that I could see looked pale. It was clear that whoever owned this hand, I wanted no business in meeting. I finally found the courage and screamed, "Hey!" hoping that this would be enough for whoever was on the other side to realize that I was awake. The door began to bang as someone began to screech loudly. This snapped me out of my fear-riddled trance. I got up, grabbed my phone and keys, and ran out of the room. I ran outside and around to my car. Thankfully, I had dropped off Jocelyn at the airport, so I still had the car. I got in still dressed in my pajamas and drove out of there. The drive back to town helped calm me down as I tried to process what had happened. It wasn't until I reached the police station that I realized how lucky I was that I woke up when I did. The station itself was closed, but after a quick phone call to 911, I got patched over to an officer on duty and told him what had happened. I made sure to explain my situation about living with my wife's uncle, but that someone was trying to enter my room from my closet. The officers on duty gathered all my information on the phone and ended up meeting me at the police station parking lot. He and his partner told me that they'd go to my address and knock on the door to see what had happened, and that I could either wait here in the parking lot or ride back with them in the cruiser. Seeing how there was no benefit for me to wait here, I insisted on riding with them, despite still being in my pajamas. I hopped in their cruiser and the officers drove me to the address I gave them, back to the outskirts of the town. We pulled up to the house and both officers looked at one another. "You said your wife's uncle lives here?" one of the officers said while looking back at me, while the other called in backup on the radio. "Yeah, this is the house," I said nervously. The 2 officers got out and I stayed behind in the cruiser. Both officers drew their weapons as they approached the front door. They knocked on the door, but no one answered. They looked around on the front porch trying to look inside the windows, but with no luck. They then made their way back to the cruisers and asked me if I was willing to take them to the lower section of the basement and let them in that way. I knew what waited for us inside, and this wasn't my house, but something tried to attack me while I was sleeping. I agreed, and got out and took them around back. The basement door was still open when I had left it that way that morning. It was still dark out and none of the basement lights were on. I walked behind the officers as they made their way inside and turned on all the lights. The basement looked normal. The locked door that led to the main section of the house was still closed. I instructed the officers to my room, which was off to the right. Once inside, the closet door was broken and leaning on the bed, leaving a dark opening for the closet. Scratch marks could be seen on the backside of the door, where whatever that thing was had tried to scratch its way through. The rest of the room was a mess, much like someone had torn up the room looking for something. "Looks like you were telling the truth," the officer said while shining his flashlight into the dark walk-in closet. "Does this thing have a light?" he asked as he glanced inside. I shook my head. No, it doesn't." After a quick glance, one of the officers walked into the dark closet for a better look. "So you're saying that you had locked this door before you went to bed, but woke up to someone trying to get out of here? It doesn't add up." The officer then shined his light up the wall and onto the ceiling. At first it looked like a normal ceiling tile, but then the officer tried to push on it with his nightstick. At first the ceiling was solid. That was until he pushed on a certain section, and to everyone's surprise, a part of the ceiling began to rise, much like a hatch. The officer wasn't very tall, so he extended his nightstick and pushed the hatch open, revealing an opening to the upstairs. We were all shocked. "We need to go upstairs," the officer said. We walked back to the front main area of the basement to the locked door that led upstairs. "We're going to need you to wait out back by the cruiser," as one of the officers escorted me back outside. I waited by the cruiser when an ambulance and other police cars arrived. The sun was off in the distance at this point, as small beams of orange crested the horizon. I watched in horror as the police unlocked the front door, and the EMTs went inside. It didn't take them long for the EMTs to start bringing out body bags. One of the original policemen that I had met with earlier came out and talked with me. After a series of questions proving that I was only living in the basement and had nothing to do with the bodies upstairs, the officer then filled me in on the situation. Apparently, this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Someone would lure people in, either with an abandoned location or an invite from someone that they thought they could trust. Evidently, me and my wife were lucky to have been able to live here as long as we did, without something happening to us. But this leaves so many unanswered questions. Who was crying that one time I peeked my head in? Who did my wife message to get us to this place? And what was that thing I saw that tried to get me in the middle of the night? Story 2. I think I saw a skinwalker. About 2 months ago, my husband, 34 male, and I, a 29 female, were staying in a camper on a friend's property in northern Wisconsin. One night I wasn't feeling very well, so I went and laid down in the camper and promptly fell asleep. A few hours later, around 3 a.m., I suddenly woke up and bolted out the door and started projectile vomiting outside by the window. My husband called out and asked if I was okay. I managed to say yeah in between rounds. When I had finally finished and felt like I was okay to go back and lay down, I spit a few more times to get rid of the taste, and as I looked up, there was a face about 3 feet in front of me in the darkness. I stared at it, and it at me. I was petrified. I couldn't move, but I was also afraid to take my eyes off of it. I slowly started to move my head up, down and side to side to try and get a better angle or a closer look, and as I did, it began to mimic my movements. There we were, in the darkness of the forest, bobbing up and down, back and forth, slowly leaning closer and closer to one another as we tried to figure each other out. I stared straight into its cold, hollow eyes. I couldn't look away in fear of what would happen if I did. It stared back at me, almost as if it didn't know what I was either. It was too dark to make out any features, but the face had the shape of a human face. But what I could see on the body from behind the truck just looked hunched over and distorted. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, until I finally managed to call out, "Babe?" "Yeah?" my husband responded. "There's something out here," I said, only slightly raising my voice. "What?" he asked. "I don't know, some kind of animal. I'm not sure, but I'm afraid to move. It's just watching me," I almost whispered to myself. He opened the door of the camper and looked out into the darkness. "Where?" he asked, unable to see what I was seeing. "It's right in front of me, just watching," I told him, bewildered that he couldn't see it. He grabbed a flashlight and shined it in front of me, and it was gone. There was nothing there. How could it not be there? I'm still very confused by this interaction. I know it was there. I saw it. It wasn't a dream, and I know I wasn't hallucinating. Can anyone tell me what they think it was? Edit. Just to respond to a few comments, I don't drink and I don't do drugs, so I was not inebriated. I don't remember all the details because I couldn't see it very well, but here's what I got. I couldn't tell how tall it was because from what I could see, it looked hunched over and disfigured. I don't think it had any fur. It was pale in color, but again it was dark, so I'm not sure what color it was. It had black eyes, soulless eyes, like looking straight into a void. It had sharp, jagged teeth, and I don't remember a nose at all. Hope this description helps. Maybe it wasn't a skinwalker because I guess they don't leave Navajo lands, but it was really scary. I should also mention that where I was in the woods of Wisconsin was not too far from the Hannahville Indian Reservation, but again not Navajo, so I'm not sure what it was. Story 3. My Skinwalker Encounter. I'm having a hard time remembering the stories told to me by my Navajo family, but when I Skype them again, I'll ask. This creepy set of events happened directly to me though, so here goes. My first personal encounter. I know, it's lengthy, but hey, skinwalkers. They require a backstory. It started when my two brothers, David and Luke's girlfriend, Sarah, all drove down to the desert to spend some time in the country. This was Resland, as it were, so red dirt was everywhere. Southern Utah, a majestically beautiful place, if you ever get the chance. We had some pistols and decided to go out and target practice. We took our gear and some old targets to a place called the Devil's Heartbeat. I had never been, but all three of them were familiar with the area. It was a canyon, about 200 feet deep. We stayed on one end of the canyon, by the drop-offs, and to our left was a ravine. About 50 feet over, the opposite side of the canyon rose up above us, were some Anasazi ruins. The Navajo may disagree with the historians on the Anasazi origins and departure. According to Navajo legend, they simply disappeared from existence, leaving behind plates, dishes, and food, and went into another dimension or something equivalent. But whatever the history, the Navajo do not like to wander in the Anasazi ruins. I never asked why, but figured it had to do something with respect, preserving history, etc. As such, none of the others cared a bit about these canyon ruins. They were more interested in shooting pistols. I could see old beds, ladders, and even cave drawings on the cliffs with my naked eye. And I got this strange fixation on going over there. I'm not Navajo, and I felt that the rules didn't apply to me. I set off down the cliffs without a rope, and decided I would climb down, cross the canyon floor, and then climb back up. This was a bad idea for a million reasons, but it was like some obsession. I can't explain the feeling. It was like magnetism. I wanted to be in those ruins, and it wasn't just some tourist-like curiosity. It felt like I meant to go there. I kept slipping and getting stuck on the rocks, and I was so frustrated I almost started crying. Finally, I was deterred by the unmistakable sound of a growl coming from the canyon floor below me. There were trees down there, so I couldn't see what was making the growl, but mountain lion immediately rose to mind, and I got my butt back up the cliffside. I said nothing to the others, and we shot the guns for a while. The only other strange occurrence was while Sarah was aiming, things got eerily quiet. We had all heard a sound from behind us, maybe 20 feet away. It was almost a growl, then a hoarse laugh. Almost like a lion and then a hyena. We had a clear view of the entire area, and there was nothing there. Certainly not on the cliff tops where we had heard it anyway. The creepy part was that David, Sarah, and I all heard it from a close distance. Luke heard the exact noise, right by his ear. We ended up camping out there to see if anything would happen, and this is when I got completely terrified. Before, I was only scared of wild animals. We had guns though, and were sleeping with no bags or tent, just some blankets under the stars and a little fire, so I felt safe when we all laid down. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but woke up a few hours later to see everyone else laying with their eyes open, listening. The canyon was completely full of noise. The only way to describe it is that people were banging rocks together. They would be one set, maybe 300 yards away, and then another clacking 200 yards away, and then 50 yards away. The canyon echoes, so it was hard to tell exactly how many rock-smashing rock noises there were, but they sounded like Morse code. We listened to this for maybe 10 minutes. No other animal noises, no nothing. Finally, David, who was kind of a hard ass and the least superstitious of his family, shouted, "Shut up!" And everything immediately stopped. My heart was in my throat. We just sat there and stared at each other, wide-eyed. It was dead quiet, and then we heard another super weird noise from the Anasazi ruins. I don't know how to explain this one either, but it kinda sounded like a zebra noise. Like these squeaky trills. It got louder, and then the rocks, sticks, whatever started up again. But this was worse, because now the other animal noises came back. We heard what sounded like wolves or coyotes barking, monkeys screeching. In my opinion, those were the most terrifying. Owls hooting, and through all that, those terrible zebra noises. We said nope, and got our happy little asses out of there immediately. It took us maybe 10 minutes to douse the fire, pack up our blankets, and speed away. The noises were continuing the entire time. That night I was obviously pretty shaken up. Before I could fall asleep again, my Navajo mother came and sat by me, and said that she could tell that I had a rough day. We hadn't mentioned the creepy stuff to avoid a lecture about messing with the spirits. She asked me about it, and I ended up spilling my guts about not seeing the canyon ruins. It was something personal. It felt like I wanted to go there. Why couldn't I go there? It would have been beautiful. After I told her all about it, I could see that she had a really concerned look on her face. "What is it?" I asked, totally confused, and she explained something that I had no idea about. The spirits in the ruins like to lure people up there. When they get up on the ground, the spirits push them off. That's why we don't go up there. I remained creeped out for the remainder of the visit. The town has a public accessible kiva, kind of like a tourist trap for a little podunk place. But since I didn't see the ruins up close, I went down into the kiva. I went alone, as of course my superstitious family refused to enter other native dwellings. I figured that nothing could push me off a cliff if I was in a kiva. I was right, but something even worse happened. Fast forward a few weeks later. I worked at a crappy call center in Salt Lake City, 3rd shift. It was my first night alone and I was feeling jumpy ever since the kiva. My brothers already warned me that I had a skinwalker following me, but I of course didn't believe it. I don't smoke, but I do follow my coworkers out for smoke breaks because I like to chat. Tonight, I lurked in the doorway because I had this terrible cloud of dread hanging over me. I was peeping out the glass door, being a total weirdo. It hit me then how paranoid I had been. That's what skinwalkers do. They mess with your mind. While I was pacing in front of the glass door, I decided that this whole thing was stupid, and that I was going to go outside and stand there for the rest of my 10-minute break. Most of the smokers were already filing back in, but I walked out and put my hands in my pockets, looked at the sky, looked in the building, mentally patting myself on the back for not being a big wuss. Then, I saw something that I'll never ever be able to give a rational or even halfway accountable explanation for. We have like 6 parking lots, and one of the far lots away from me, maybe 100 feet, I could see something walking. It was a dog, obviously, but it was almost limping and walked like it was tired or hurt. Animal lover me forgot all about the skinwalkers, and I started walking towards it, making the ch-ch-ch, come here doggy noises. And then, I stopped abruptly. The dog had the body form of a greyhound, and it was gray. But there was something very wrong with it. It had bloody legs and limped, but it walked almost like a person would, on hands and feet, but its butt was moving to and fro, if that makes any sense. Whenever it heard me, it just stopped without turning, something I've never known any dog to do. And finally, it looked over its shoulder at me, and this is the freaky part. This dog was looking at me the way a person does. It had huge eyes, way too big for a greyhound, and its teeth were bare, like it was considering biting me. Then it growled, but it was like a whistle growl, noises no regular animal makes. It almost sounded like it wanted to talk to me, or it was taunting me. Somehow in the middle of all of this, I realized that it didn't have a tail. And then I heard from all Navajo stories that skinwalkers, when they appear as animals, don't have tails. Forgetting all logic and rationality, I turned and jetted. I didn't look back until I was back inside the building and had pulled the door shut behind me. And by then, when I looked, of course, the freaking thing was gone. When I described this to my brothers, they were absolutely sure it was a skinwalker, and they went through the trouble of blessing me in my apartment, them in their apartments. I never saw the creepy bloody dog again, and I never since even slightly wanted to visit the cliff ruins. Story 4. I believe I saw a skinwalker. I was camping in the Lewis and Clark Forest in Montana, land that was heavily populated by natives way back then. Me and 3 friends were hanging out by a fire and just talking and joking around. It was late, probably around midnight. I heard what sounded like gravel being kicked on the gravel road over my right shoulder. I snapped my head back, and for a split second, I saw a 10-foot tall gray figure standing on the road. It scared me so bad that I had to look away. I looked back, expecting to be just as scared, but it was gone. Then there was nothing but the vast forest. My friends and I immediately went over there where I saw this figure. They were intrigued because they know I wouldn't make something like this up and react how I reacted. I most definitely jumped and said some swear words. We checked all around in the area and out in the trees and brush. We heard a branch snap what seemed like a few trees away, but our phone flashlights weren't too good at lighting up the forest. There were no traces of anything, and after the branch snapped, and my friends were spooked and just wanted to go into their tent. I for sure was not going to sleep that night. Later, I convinced my buddy to come with me to drive out into a clearing so we can enjoy some music and watch the stars. He knows and studies astrology in college. We rolled down the window and the sunroof and hung out for probably 20 minutes before we got scared to crap. We could hear what sounded like a group of little girls chanting, not too far away from the car. We listened to it for 20 seconds, and it definitely sounded like it was approaching. We quickly got out of there and went back to the campsite. Story 5. The Father Thing. Hello everyone. Like a previous poster I've seen on here, I'm from the UK. I know that this might be out of place here, but feel like there's some similarities to my story that others might get a kick out of. Full disclosure, I am a psychologist and a researcher. I am firmly agnostic on the notion of anything possibly supernatural existing, but when pressed for what I believe, I am resolutely atheist. Could something be out there? I don't know. Do I believe something is out there? Given the evidence presented, I think there isn't. However, being a good scientist means being honest about the experiences that don't fit within your rubric. I have psychological explanations for the following story, but they always feel incomplete. This takes place in 1990/1. I was lucky enough to have grown up at a time when people could think about buying a house in central London without having to be oligarchs or oil aristocracy. It was a 2-floor Victorian flat with a large garden just around the corner from the Natural History Museum, which is truly amazing when I look back on it. I was about 6 years old and my father was increasingly traveling for work at this point, but that was nothing out of the ordinary. It was the middle of the day. My grandmother, mother, and older sister were downstairs in the kitchen/dining room, which led to the garden. I don't know what spurred me on, but I went up the spiral staircase, running as part of some game where I was enthusiastically going full pelt. I remember feeling happy and breathlessly excited, and the sudden jarring emotional turn. I remember stopped, dead in my tracks with a deep feeling of fear, like every fiber of my being was screaming that there was danger and something was off. Even writing this now, I can't evoke that feeling, and my hair stands on end. I don't recalling the memory and tell this story very rarely. At the top of the stairs, there was a landing between the living room and my parents' room. My parents' room had a wall of mirrors that contained closets. Standing in front of the old small TV, adjusting his bow tie, was my dad. My dad, who absolutely couldn't be there, turns to me and gestures to me over with one hand, while smiling at me. I was being called into the room with a familiar smile and a friendly gesture. At this point, my frozen apprehension broke, taken over by sheer terror. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I could. I had always been hesitant about running down those stairs as fast as I could climb them, as I had previously toppled down and knocked out my front tooth when I was younger. No such hesitation now. No such hesitation, I threw myself down and immediately sought out my very Irish grandmother, who wore these long flowing dresses and clung onto her dress for dear life. I could tell that she was a bit surprised. At the time, I didn't know how to express what I was feeling or what had just happened. I just clung on for a while. My granny could tell that something was wrong but didn't press me for answers, which was an odd response given her character and how I was behaving. It would be a very long time before I could convey this story to anyone. At the time, I just felt I needed to be right on her to be safe. I don't recall if I've ever told her, which I feel a little sad about upon reflection, as our relationship didn't end well, and she passed away a few years ago. That image of my father thing calling me over still bothers me, which is frustrating as, on its surface, the experience of seeing my father prepared to head out to work while I sat on the bed behind him is usually one that brings only a happy sense of nostalgia. On a side note, I was raised Catholic, but we didn't really take it seriously. We grew up with some stories of the fae folk and folklore of Ireland, but again, nothing ever given a tremendous amount of weight. My grandmother deeply disliked religion and called herself an atheist, but was often referred to as a witch partly as a joke because she could be very domineering, but also because there was a belief amongst my family members that she had a habit of predicting the future and having a sixth sense about things. I don't believe any of that myself, but thought that a few of you may value that detail. There's only one other story I have that borders on the otherworldly, but that one is probably not relevant here, and doesn't carry any of the weight or dread. This one does. Story 6. Survival of the Coyote. Writing has always been a way for me to organize my thoughts. However, for the past couple of years, it has been a luxury I simply could not afford. Yet, here I sit, alone, far from home, and all I want to do is write about what has happened to my life, because I fear that this might be the very last chance I will ever get to tell my story. My name is John Lawrence. As of writing this, I just recently turned 20 years old. I have been homeless now for 3 years. When I was 17, my parents kicked me out of my house and onto the streets. They could not understand me. They called me sinful and disowned me. I would later learn that they told others that I ran away from home so they could avoid any consequences of their abandonment. In a way, I did. I left town on a bus with what little money I had on me. That first night, I slept at a bus station for what could only be for a few hours, my mind and body racing from the confrontation. My life slowly became one of survival. I used to think about the future, but now it is only a matter of making it one day at a time. I had no phone, no contacts. I was on my own. Shelters helped at first. I met people there, people who showed me how to survive, where to find food and when, where to find shelter, how to beg. There was no longer any room for pride. I saw the best and worst of people. I met men that were willing to give all they had, or give away as much food as they could spare. I've seen people who would attack other homeless while filming it on a phone, laughing. I saw a man give up and take his own life. I do not have enough paper to write everything I saw from the outside of humanity's society. To many, I became invisible. After I turned 18, things only became harder for me. I was no longer a priority for shelters, and I slept on the streets more than ever before. Begging became harder as well. The more I withered and became dirty, the less people would spare anything to me, despite the even greater need. That is when I met Frank. Frank was Frank. No last name, claiming he had no family that would share one with him. He taught me the art of train hopping. The East was too cold, but he claimed that the West was more welcoming, warmer, and easier to survive all around. While he was certainly exaggerating, I agreed to travel with him. Frank was an interesting man. He spoke of the great American tradition of train hopping like a knight speaking of his family's deeds. He taught, never say you don't want to die, but rather say that you want to live. However, he never lived those words himself. He had done things to survive that he was not proud of, and you could see the toll it had taken on the man. He drank himself stupid when he could find alcohol. As such, we were not always together, but we always agreed to meet up before hopping on a train to the next town. Life seemed to move on the same way for some time. We would hop on a train and split up at the next town. We would look for food, shelter, money, and Frank would look for his medication. Frank was not entirely wrong. Things were a little more easier going out west. We never stayed in one place for too long, a week or so at most. We arranged places and times to meet ahead of time in case we were chased off or ran into trouble. I felt like I was some sort of secret agent, infiltrating each town undercover. It was exciting in a way. It at least kept my mind off of other troubles. In small towns and good weather, it was safer to sleep in the wooded areas away from people. We were in a small wooded area just outside of town that night. Frank had already set up a makeshift campsite by the time I had arrived. The sun was already down, and I was afraid I would have to find a place to sleep without him, until I nearly tripped over his camp. The camp was nothing but a small clearing on a flat ground. A fire was a bad idea, but a couple of old worn sleeping bags on top of some cardboard felt like heaven. Frank used an old metal flashlight when needed. I set down my worn old backpack, and we talked for a while and shared a bit of food, until a stray dog startled us. A mutt with a bit of pitbull in him, begging for food. I threw a bit of old jerky his way and he just grabbed it and ran off. Frank shook his head, but he didn't say anything. When I woke in the middle of the night, my entire world changed. A large black coyote had wandered into camp. I tried to jump out of my sleeping bag to scare it off, but the moment I started to move, it locked eyes with me. I was paralyzed. No noise would escape my mouth while Frank slept on the ground, unaware of the danger. Then, the animal started to change right before me. It began to walk on two legs as it took the shape of a man. He/it wore a mask made out of the tanned face of a coyote, not unlike the coyote he'd just changed shape from. The mask was missing the coyote's lower jaw and exposed his emotionless mouth. He looked out the eyes of the coyote skin, scanning the surroundings. It stalked closer to Frank, slowly, like an animal closing in for the kill. I tried to jump to my feet, but the moment I started to move, it locked eyes with me again. All strength suddenly left me, and I was paralyzed. Helpless only to watch what came next, with one swift motion, he put his hand over Frank's eyes. I watched in morbid anticipation for what would happen. After long seconds of nothing, Frank started to convulse in pain. Blood dripped out of his nose before all movement stopped. The coyote man then removed his hand to reveal Frank's lifeless eyes. His body laid still on the ground. I was his next target. My heart raced. My face turned white in terror. He stalked towards me with a grin. His eyes seemed to glow inside the mask. I struggled in vain as he put his hand over my eyes, like he did with Frank. My world would turn black. I could feel my mind, my consciousness being pulled away. It felt as if I was falling into a void of blackness. Then, I saw something. A face in the darkness. A mass of blackness that I struggled to describe. It seemed to grin as I was pulled towards it. Suddenly, I was snapped back to reality with the sounds of barking. The dog from before. It came back and was barking and growling fiercely, surprisingly both me and my attacker. With the sudden realization I could move, I slapped my attacker's hand away and threw my weight on him as I got to my feet. As he fell backwards, I ran. I turned my mind off and let instincts take over, running faster than I ever had before. I collapsed under a bridge some distance away, completely exhausted. I dreamed of dark things that night. Looking out of the eyes of a wolf mask, I saw human bones harvested out of red flesh. Then I saw a scene that seemed ages ago of Native Americans dancing and singing to something in a fire. The scene transformed into another setting of an old stone room filled with markings made with blood as European men spoke Latin. Again, I saw the same blackness as before. I saw the face again, made of black smoke and clearly grinning. The scene changed once again. This time I was standing in front of a fireplace in what appeared to be the middle of nowhere. Across from the fire sat the man with the coyote face. However, this time it was no mask, but part of his body. He spoke to me in a deep voice, his words echoing as he did. "You have been traveling a place you have not been meant to visit," he said, as he motioned for me to take a seat. I stood and answered back, "What are you?" He smiled. "I am many things. A mage, a warlock, alchemist, witch, skinwalker. I appropriate spells of power from many cultures, as it matters not the origin of the spell, but rather its master, my will, empowers it. Many such cultures have reached him before, intentional or not." I was a bit shocked at his honesty before he told me. "A better question is, who are you?" Before I could reply, he answered his own question. "A blundered sacrifice, whose soul has been stretched between another world and the world you consider your own. Your soul will rip if such situations remain." With a grand wave of his hand, I was flung backwards, falling until I woke in a shock under the bridge I spent the night. I was cold, wet, dirty. Everything I owned was back where it all happened. I decided to go back, not just for the supplies, but for also my own sanity. What I found shocked me. The dog that once saved my life was chewing on the corpse of my old friend. He growled at me as I approached, but after a loud scream from me, he relented his meal. Only a bloody mess lay where my friend once did. I grabbed my belongings and Frank's flashlight. I wanted to call the police or anyone and tell them what had happened and where Frank's remains were. I searched for a payphone before I had to give up. I threw up in the alleyway. I felt weak and tired. The world was spinning. I dreamed again of the man in the coyote face. He sat again at the campfire, chewing on raw meat. He looked at me, the meat vanishing. "The laws of this world are different from the one you're used to. You have two fates ahead of you, boy. You do nothing and let your soul be ripped apart, you will find your body will quickly follow. Or, you let me complete my spell and give your soul to my master. I assure you this fate will be less painless if you wish to give yourself up. Or perhaps simply seek revenge before you die. Find me in the center of the fire break in the very woods we first met at the witching hour." I awoke, weak and groggy. I could feel something was wrong with me. My instincts told me that the coyote man was telling me the truth. I would die soon, if nothing was changed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a wad of dollar bills and some change. All the money I had, gained from begging. I found a pharmacy/convenience store. I bought a handful of candy, a pen, and a notepad. While sucking on sugary sweets, I started to write this journal. Like a warrior of old meditating before battle, this was my way to mentally prepare. I had to face him again. I made my way to the fire break early, while the sun was still up. I did not know what to expect. Would he kill me without saying a word? Or would he sit and talk to me like he did in my dreams? I felt a strong pull in my mind, and my eyes began to haze before I was forced to take a seat on the ground. Once again, I saw the old worshippers of the face in the darkness. A man in primitive clothing yelled at the darkness before being swallowed by it. Then I saw another world, a world full of sand and a dark blue sky that kept the land in an eternal twilight. It felt alien and cold. Was this where the face lives? Where my soul is being forced? I awoke to see the tan coyote mask staring down on me. He was already over top of me, bending down to meet my face near his, stars resting in the sky. I was out for some time. I could not move. All I could do was look into the eyes of my foe standing over me. His brown eyes looking out of the mask reminded me that he was human. In my dreams, he seemed more than a man, but in reality, he was just that. Powerful human. I summoned all my will to move. I tried with every cell in my body to fight and win. I did not want to die. I wanted to live. As if to answer my will to fight, I saw in my mind the dark figure grinning at me. With that, I was free. What I could see of the face under the coyote skin changed to shock. Before he could understand why I could move, I felt around the ground for a weapon, finding the heavy metal flashlight. I swung it like a club at my would-be hunter. With a thud, I hit him aside the head, and he fell sideways. My hand stung with the impact, and my blood rushed with adrenaline. I did not hesitate and found my way to my feet and hit him again, this time knocking off his mask. I could see the face of a man. He screamed at me angrily as he tried to attack me. One last time I hit him in the head with the flashlight. This time he went limp. He lay dead on the ground, blood pooling under his head. I had won, but not wholly by my own power. That thing he called Master let me win. I watched as a puddle of blood grew. I could feel myself getting weaker once again. At first I felt content to die, having defeated that one thing that started all of this. However, my mind turned to panic. I did not want to die. Once again I started to lose consciousness. I was afraid I would not wake back up this time. Before my eyes closed, I frantically looked around for something, anything to aid me, but it was pointless. For a moment everything was black, but then knowledge filled my head. I saw visions of a spell, a magic to reunite my body and soul. My eyes opened with a jolt of new energy, and I started working. Taking the blood of the man who tried to destroy my soul, I created symbols in the dirt, old symbols, of which I did not know the true meaning. I only needed to add my own blood and the spell was complete. As soon as I finished, my visions faded once more, but only for a moment. In that moment, the world around me had changed. I was in the land of sand, in a dark blue sky just like my visions. However, this was far more real. There was a lack of wind that gave the world an odd sensation. In my immediate position, I saw belongings, this journal, and the corpse of the man I killed. My spell had worked. My soul and body were reunited. However, it seemed that my body traveled to where my soul was being pulled, and not the other way around. I sat for a long time in this world. There are no stars or sun to mark the time. Soon I will travel on and look for a way to survive. This may be the world where the master whose magic allowed all of this lives, but I've run out of fear, and I'm still pushed to live. I still remember the words of my friend. Never say you don't want to die, but rather, say you want to live. I'm leaving these last few pages of the journal here, perhaps as a message for anyone who enters this world in the same place I did, or perhaps I just feel the need to move on. They may even find a way back, before I do. Story 7. Forgotten by Time. Time doesn't stop, no matter what you do. You can't stop time from flowing. It won't stop. But what time does do is forget. The bad events become bad memories, which become bad dreams, which fade into the smallest of dark stains on history. This is good. This is natural. This buries things that should be buried, that must be buried for the world's sake. And the worst thing that you can do is go around digging those things up, making time remember what should be forgotten for eternity. I live in New Mexico, out in the country. I never get bored with the outdoors. There's so many weird rock formations to climb, so much odd geography to explore. But the one thing that interests me most about where I live is the archaeology. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, This area was colonized by the Native Americans known as the Anasazi. The word is actually Navajo, meaning ancient ones or ancient enemy. They built cities out of stone, sometimes sprawling across the ground, sometimes built into the side of cliffs. I saw some of the biggest ones at Chaco Canyon. That's what captured my interest to begin with. If you've ever seen them, you'll know what I mean. There's just something about those strange circular structures that fills you with a sense of awe. But now those cities have been ground down by the wind. They're little more than ruins anymore. That's because they were abandoned long ago. No one knows what happened to the people who lived there. They just all vanished, leaving nothing but ruins and a few pottery shards. There have been stories, of course, that it was drought or famine that drove them all away. But I never liked that explanation. It just didn't seem right. 1 week after my 16th birthday, I went out and got my driver's license. I was thrilled. Finally, total freedom. That weekend, me and some friends decided to go out on a camping trip out in the hills. So Saturday morning, I picked up everyone and we headed out. After a few hours of driving, we found a place that was secluded enough without looking like it was protected by some national park. Stopping the car, we decided to stretch our legs a little before setting up camp. We were parked at the end of a small valley, with hills rising up on 3 sides. Deciding to explore a little, we climbed up the nearest one. Getting to the top, we were greeted by an amazing sight. It was a ring of large hills, with an enormous depression in the center. Rising out of that depression was the oddest mountain I have ever seen. The half of the far side from us was normal, rising up at a steep slope. Facing us, however, the mountain came out into a huge overhang, obscuring our vision of what lay beneath. We looked at each other and then started sliding our way down towards it. Upon reaching the bottom, we were greeted by an even more impressive sight. It was a huge Anasazi city, spread out under the overhang. Better yet, it looked almost completely undamaged, located in such a place as perfectly sheltered by the wind. Looking at it, I knew that we were the first people to see it in hundreds of years. As excited as I was, something made me hesitate to explore. I don't know what it was, but after a few seconds it had passed, and I was jogging forwards towards the ruins. Seeing the city as it had been originally built was amazing. I thought of how useful it would be to study their culture. The one thing that put me off, though, were the skeletons. Human bones littered almost every floor. I didn't know enough to be able to determine what had killed all these people, but it looked like that they all died at once. I suddenly realized that I had gotten separated from my friends. Calling out, I got no answer. I started walking through the ruins looking for them, then jogging, then running. Coming around a corner, I nearly ran smack into them. They were standing in the doorway to the largest room I'd ever seen so far, staring in. Annoyed, I pushed past them to see what they were looking at. I found it. The skeletons were intact in this room. I wish they weren't. That way my brain could make up excuses. Most of them were still definitely human. The other ones, though, I don't know what they were. It was as if a human skeleton had been partially molded into that of a coyote. The skulls were elongated, the spines stooped, the fingers clawed. In the center of the room was a jet black pedestal. On it laid another skeleton. None of us really wanted to go in, but we did anyways. Walking towards the bizarre skeletons, I almost tripped over a strange rod. Picking it up, I couldn't tell what it was, or what it was made out of. I asked my friends to come look at it. One of them took it and, as a joke, jabbed it into the chest of my oldest friend, Pete. Not expecting the attack, Pete stumbled backwards and tripped, landing on the pedestal. He didn't move again. The guy who had jabbed him walked over to him to help him up, rod still in hand. As soon as that rod touched the pedestal, there was a flash of light and a rushing sound. Clearing my vision, I saw that Pete was moving now. He was writhing in pain, and once my hearing came back, I realized that he was screaming as well. The guy who had jabbed him moved to help, but jumped back as Peter rolled onto the floor, scattering the bones. As he thrashed, I saw that his body started to warp. Then, without warning, he lay still. Looking at him in horror, I realized that his features matched the weird skeletons next to him. He had somehow been transformed. Pete stared up into the eyes of the guy who had, by accident, done that to him. What he did next, I don't like to think about. I watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but that was nothing compared to what happened next. I didn't stop. I didn't even think. I just ran. Sprinting through the ruined buildings, I heard another person yelp as he went down. Then another. Then it was just me and what used to be Pete, bursting out into the sunlight. I sprinted to the base of the hill. Turning back, I saw Pete standing in the doorway, watching me. Before my eyes, his body twisted and shrunk, until he just looked like an ordinary coyote. I took a step backwards. The coyote snarled and ran towards me. Whimpering, I turned and scrambled up the hill. The coyote was much faster. Much faster. By the time I'd reached the top, it was upon me. I could feel its body slam into my back, sending us both rolling down the other side of the hill. Twisting to face the thing, I pulled my arm back and slammed my fist into its muzzle. It yelped in pain. I tried to hit it again, but this time the thing was expecting my blow. Just before my fist made contact with its face, the coyote opened its mouth and bit down on my fist. Yelling, I smashed my head into it, making it let go. We hit the bottom and rolled apart. Struggling to my feet, I saw the coyote twisting and warping back into Pete's form. He was scratched up and his nose was broken. He was wearing nothing but a coyote pelt wrapped around him. "Jack, please, help me," he moaned. I walked over and started to stoop down to help him up. Then I saw his eyes. They were coyote eyes. I stared back, and with a snarl, he lunged at me. Only now remembering the knife in my belt, I pulled it and stabbed it into his chest. His body shuddered, then went still. I stepped back again as his skin began to crumble into dust. It blew away, leaving nothing but a skeleton of a human crossed with a coyote. The rest of the story is uninteresting, me dealing with the police and the therapist mostly. I told them that a madman in the hills had killed my friends, and I gave them the wrong location for where it happened. I think that those ancient cities died for a reason, that humans aren't ready for that kind of magic that had been discovered in them. The magic that let people transform into those things that I now know are called skinwalkers. I didn't used to believe in magic and monsters and the paranormal. Now I know the truth. My name is Jack Davis, and I intend to keep that truth from hurting anyone else.